Good. So we are
Okay,
recording.
America's starting the recording of it.
Today is August 26th, and we are here for the first session of our four-part series on the Book of Jonah, the prophet Jonah, and this is session 1. So let's open with prayer. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Gracious, loving God, we thank you for this opportunity to study your word. Thank you for gathering us together in your name. And we ask for wisdom and guidance as we dive into the story of your prophet Jonah and his experience of your direction in his life. We ask, Lord, for wisdom in our conversations and just insight in our discussions and reflections. And may all that we say and do be to the honor and glory of your name, through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
All right, well, I'm going to share my screen as usual with...
Don't you dare. Don't you dare.
First of all, what I'm going to do is mute everybody. There we go. So I'm going to share my screen, and can y'all see that? Good, awesome. All right, so Jonah, into the storm of God's grace, session 1. So what I want to do is spend a bit of time setting this up and giving some background to the book of Jonah. I must say that reading and rereading Jonah in preparation for this study and listening to some lectures and reading commentaries, I have come personally to a much deeper appreciation of the book of Jonah. And I hope that you all will too. It's a relatively short book. In my Bible that I carry around, it's on 1-2 page spread. I can read the whole thing without turning a page. So that means we'll be able to go into some depth into each of the 4 chapters over the next 4 weeks. So a bit of introduction. First of all, I really want us to get into our heads that the story of Jonah is about more than a big fish, right? A lot more than the big fish. And I was listening to a teaching series by a pastor named Tim Mackey. He's out in Oregon. And his whole series, he said, was sort of a rescue effort from what he calls the VeggieTale factor, right? That most of what people know about the book of Jonah comes from children's literature, which isn't a bad thing. We get introduced to these stories early on, but for the most part, children's literature that tells us sort of the major stories of the Bible, is pretty watered down and misses a lot of the depth and nuance of these biblical stories. And for me personally, I would say I was an adult. I mean, I had grown up in the church and studied the Bible, and I was an adult before I really knew about chapter 4 of Jonah. If you read a children's book, it's basically chapters 1 through 3. Jonah runs from God, he gets swallowed by a whale, the whale spits him out, and Jonah fulfills his mission, and everyone is happy, right? Well, that's not how it ends, right? There's chapter 4, which is really the theological crux of the whole book. So it's not just about the big fish. There's a lot going on that we're going to uncover over the next 4 weeks. So there's the book is highly structured. So there's 4 chapters, and it moves in this A-B pattern. So chapter 1, Jonah encounters these non-Israelites, the pagan sailors on the ship that he's taking to Tarshish. And that's followed in chapter 2 by a prayer or a response from Jonah. In chapter 2, it's from inside the fish. Chapter 3 is a second encounter with non-Israelites, the pagan, vile Ninevites. And then chapter 4 is another prayer from Jonah, a response from Jonah, an angry response from Jonah under the vine. So this A-B pattern, very highly structured in terms of the story of Jonah. Now, this is really critical. How do we read this book in terms of its style and genre? And this is where I think the book has been misread, even by priests and pastors. I think I've misread it for years, because the genre is really satire. the use of humor, irony, exaggeration. The book is full of humor. You can read it really straight, but if you read it with its humor, you will laugh out loud. Like when the king of Nineveh calls for repentance, he includes the animals, right? So you're supposed to think of the cows wearing sackcloth and ashes and kneeling in repentance to God. Totally ridiculous, this humorous image. A lot of irony, right? The prophet, the man of God, Jonah, in chapter 1, doesn't fear God or fear Yahweh, but the pagan sailors do. In chapter 3, Jonah, the man of God, doesn't understand and grasp God's mercy, but the pagan Ninevites do. So this great irony and tension in the book. Exaggeration. The Hebrew word for huge is used 15 times in the span of 2 pages, right? 15 times. Everything is huge. The storm is huge. The waves are huge. The whale, the fish is huge. The city of Nineveh is huge. It says that it's 3 days to journey through Nineveh, which would make it about 45 miles across, 45 to 60 miles across. There were no ancient cities that were 45 miles across, right? So a lot of exaggeration for effect in the book. So as you're reading through Jonah, one thing to do is to think Saturday Night Live, right? Now, I know it's hard for us to connect Saturday Night Live with the Bible, right? But if you think about the way satire works, it takes known characters, what are these stock characters, puts them in crazy, ridiculous situations in order to reveal our own vices, shortcomings, weaknesses, etc. And ultimately what happens is when satire is about looking in a mirror, right? So what's supposed to happen as you read Jonah is you're like, this is ridiculous. All these crazy things are happening. Jonah, the man of God, is doing all the wrong things. He really gets, put in the corner at the end of the story. The book ends with a question. It doesn't even have a nice, narrative ending. It ends with a question. And the reader is supposed to then be like, this is about us, right? Everything that Jonah's going through is really about us looking in the mirror and seeing our own, the ways in which we don't understand God's grace and God's mercy. So if you've never read the Bible as satire, Jonah is your chance, right? So if you already read through the book, reread it again, look for the humor, look for the irony, look for the exaggeration, and it will change the way you hear and understand the book. Okay, more about style and genre. There are 2 basic camps in scholarship about what Jonah is as a book. Is it an historical account? Is this sort of an episode that happened in some form, and it's being written down and then passed down through this narrative tradition? Or is it more of a parable, right? Is it meant to be a story using real characters and real cities and historical elements, but it's a parable much the way Jesus used parables. And Jesus used real figures. There were named figures in the parables of Jesus, like Lazarus, the beggar. That's somebody that his listeners probably knew about. Did that story really happen? Probably not. But Jesus mixed these historical elements with the parabolic elements. And I put and or in the middle because this has been a divide that has actually really been unhelpful. It's kind of been a litmus test. Do you really believe that Jonah was in the belly of a whale, or is this more of a parable and metaphor? And if you don't believe that it really happened, then you don't believe in the inspiration of Scripture. And it's been sort of one of those 20th century, how do we read the Bible litmus tests. I think there's ways to hold them together, this historical element, because Jonah was a historical figure. We know he had other encounters with other people in the Old Testament, but there's also this parabolic structure in terms of, how the book unfolds. Okay, a few words about historical setting. As I mentioned, we know that Jonah was an historical figure. He's mentioned in 2 Kings 14. He actually prophesies to King Jeroboam II. Jeroboam was a pretty a bad dude, but yet Jonah prophesies favor over Jeroboam II. What's interesting is if you read, I think it's Amos. Amos actually is writing about the same time and writes the exact opposite of what Jonah writes. Kind of, we've got these opposing views between Jonah in 2 Kings and what Amos is saying. And so if you are aware of that in the Old Testament, the historical context, Jonah may already be suspect, right? Because he's the one prophesying favor over this horrible king, and Amos is sort of countering that. But people would have known about Jonah. People knew that he was a prophet. The Assyrian Empire figures prominently in the book. Major empire in the ancient world, existed in some form for almost 1,500 years until finally in about the year 612, the city of Nineveh itself was overtaken by the Babylonians. The Assyrian Empire is the empire that conquered the northern kingdom of Israel in 722. So again, the readers of Jonah would have known about the presence and power of the Assyrian Empire. And it was known for its military power and brutality, especially its brutality. And when we look at chapter 3, there's some archaeological things I'll share with you about what we know about the Assyrian Empire and their military tactics, which were pretty gruesome to say the least. Nineveh was the capital city of Assyria. For a period of time, it was the largest city in the world. Still not large enough to take 3 days to go through, but a big city. It had a wall around it that was 7.5 miles long, which again, by ancient standards, was a big city. And as the center of the Assyrian Empire, it was the center of military and political power. Here's a map that shows you the Assyrian Empire. This sort of darker green is what the Assyrian Empire was in the early part of the 9th century. And the lighter green is what it became by the 7th century. So massive expansion of the empire in just about 150 years. You'll notice though, there's this little sort of yellow section here, which says Judah, and that was the southern kingdom of Israel that was not conquered by the Assyrians and remained. So it's just amazing that that remnant was protected, surrounded by this massive Assyrian empire. Of course, it will be the Babylonians that come later that will conquer the southern kingdom of Judah. But this gives you a sense of the scope of the Assyrian empire. And this is Nineveh. This was where the capital city of Nineveh was. Present day, it would be in the northern region of present-day Iraq, kind of the region of Mosul in northern Iraq. When was Jonah written? We don't really know. We don't have it clear. There's no dates or no historical figures. The king of Nineveh isn't even named. Kind of like Pharaoh in the book of Exodus is never named. He's just the Pharaoh. So we don't quite know when it was written. Because of a lot of what it's describing theologically, it probably came to its final form around the Babylonian exile, which is the case with many of the prophets during or after. This was a time of great trauma to the Jewish community. Issues of theodicy, which is sort of the justice of God. How could God allow these things to happen? And a time of regeneration of Jewish identity, which we see happening in the book. Okay, so I'm not going to unshare my screen just yet, but I do want to start and have someone read just the first 3 verses of Jonah. So Janice, I can see you, so if you could unmute yourself and read just the first 3 verses.
The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me. But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed to Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for that port. After paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord.
Perfect. There's a lot packed in just the first 3 verses. So before we jump into the rest of chapter 1, I wanted to just, because this will help us understand the rest of the chapter and the rest of the book. The book starts with the word of the Lord came to Jonah. What does that sound like, right? The introduction to a prophetic book. If you turn the page and look at the book of Malachi, it begins the same exact way. The word of the Lord came to Malachi. Same exact phrasing and structure. The difference, of course, and this is the irony, and everything sort of upside down in the book of Jonah. It's not a book that is the words of the prophet, like every other prophet, Micah, Amos, Obadiah, Hosea, any of those prophets. You're getting the words of the prophet. Jonah is the only book that is a story about the prophet. So if you're hearing this read aloud, the word of the Lord came to Jonah, you're settling back in your seat thinking you're going to hear the oracles of Jonah. And then what you get is a narrative story about the prophet Jonah. So the whole story is turned upside down right away when you realize it's not the words of the prophet, but a story about the prophet. Jonah, son of Amittai. Jonah, the name Jonah means dove, and Amittai means faithfulness. So if you were to translate Jonah's name, it would be dove, son of faithfulness, right? And again, here's irony, because Jonah is anything but a gentle dove in the story, and he's the most faithless character in the story, right? And we'll talk about that, but he ultimately is successful in his mission, but it actually is something that really makes Jonah mad that was a success. So dove, son of faithfulness, as a name is somewhat ironic. And then Tarshish, right? God says to go to Nineveh, which is east. We saw on the map, it's east towards the center of the Assyrian Empire. Tarshish is west, and it's essentially the end of the known world. So here's a map, and you can see here's the region of Israel where Jonah would have been residing. He goes down to Joppa, the port city. Nineveh is over here to the east, and Jonah sets sail for the farthest point possible, the port city of Tarshish in southern Spain. The only thing beyond Tarshish is ocean, right? Is the chaos of the water. Of course, the new world is nowhere near being discovered. So that's the end of the world as people know it. So, and again, this is exaggeration. This is part of the satire of the story, right? That the man of God, the one to whom the word of the Lord, the word of Yahweh comes, doesn't go anywhere near the place where he's supposed to go, but goes literally to the end of the world in the other direction. So let me stop there. I'm going to stop my screen. And before we jump into the rest of the book, are there any other comments or questions about what we're getting ourselves into here with the book of Jonah? Yeah, Janice.
Janice, me? Yeah.
Yeah.
I just want to say this, when you started with satire, I came upon the most amazing, funny sermon. It's called Jonah the Rebel Who God Used by Dr. Tony Evans. This guy is a Black preacher. It is hysterically funny, but it is so poignant. Like you said, always thought of it as a child's story, and it's not a child's story. It is so in depth. So if anybody, I found that on YouTube. It is so funny, and I highly recommend it. But either he said it, if Jonah had listened to God, it was 550 miles to go to Nineveh. It was 2,500 miles to go in the other direction, and that was his choice.
Yeah, Absolutely. Yeah, I haven't seen Tony. I've got a couple
Do you
books
know of
by
him?
Tony Evans, but I know of him. I haven't seen his
Oh,
and Jonah.
please watch it. It is.
Yeah, that must be her dog. Other reactions to or questions about the style, genre, historical setting. Um, I really hope that you're going to enjoy Jonah as much as I enjoyed getting back into it and reading it. I have a totally new appreciation um, for the book of Jonah.
So, Doug, just quick question.
Yeah.
So, do we interpret this to mean that he was mad at God for telling him he needed to go there? So he was mad and trying to flee. Was he like mad, or he just wanted to hide, or what do you?
Well,
what are
that's
your
great.
thoughts?
That's a great question. So we don't know at this point, right? In the story, it doesn't say why he flees from. And again, every time you see the word Lord in small caps in your Bible, it's the divine name Yahweh, right? So this is this whole journey of Jonah and Yahweh. But later in chapter 4, Jonah reveals his motive, right? He tells God, I knew that you were going to be merciful to the Ninevites. And so I didn't want to go because I knew that you were going to have grace and show mercy and forgive them, right? And so that's the reason that gets revealed later on, that he flees in the other direction, because he does not want to be a part of God's mission of mercy and grace to these horrible, awful Ninevites. And when we look at chapter 3, and I give you some of the context and historical background, you'll see why, the Israelites themselves, it's like looking in the mirror, right? They're all probably a bit like Jonah in terms of not wanting to forgive the Ninevites. And even in chapter 1, verse 2, where it says, arise, go to Nineveh, that great city. Here's the first use of the word huge, right? And call against it, for their evil has come up before me. If you're listening to this as an Israelite, you're thinking, yeah, Jonah, go get them, as you're reading this. And it's setting up the reader to think that Jonah is going to go issue an oracle of judgment. And then, of course, that's not what happens at all. Are we ready to move on? All right, will someone read chapter 1, 4 through 6? 4 through 6. Wendy, you want to read that for us? Got to unmute yourself.
And the Lord hurled a great wind on the sea, and there was a great storm on the sea, so that the ship was about to break up. Then the sailors became afraid, and every man cried to his God, and they threw the cargo which was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. But Jonah had gone below into the hold of the ship, lain down, and fallen sound asleep. So the captain approached him and said, how is it that you are sleeping? Get up, call on your God. Perhaps your God will be concerned about us, so that we will not perish. And each man said to his
That's
mate,
good. You can stop
Is
there.
that it?
That's
Okay.
good. Yeah. So Jonah's on the ship. He's paid his fare. So they're like, come on board. You paid your fare. We're going to Tarshish. And no sooner do they leave Joppa, the port of Joppa, and this great wind, another usage of the word huge, this huge wind, mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship threatened to break up. And I was reading that the word here is actually, if you were to translate this, the ship almost has a mind here. It's like the ship thought about breaking up, right? The ship considered breaking up. So the ship is almost a character in the story. The mariners were afraid, and each cried out to his God. So we know they're pagan sailors, and in a polytheistic world, this would have been their approach to prayer, sort of this shotgun approach, right? Everyone had their local gods, their city gods, and they just started, shouting these petitions to whatever God they could think of and name in the moment. When nothing is happening, their next step is to start throwing stuff overboard, lighten the ship, and do whatever they can to save themselves and to save their mission. But if you think about it, the minute they throw their cargo over, their mission now has been aborted, right? Because whatever revenue or whatever they were getting paid for that cargo is lost. They're just trying to save their lives at this point. Where's Jonah?
He's asleep.
You guys can, we're small enough. We can unmute. If you want to unmute yourselves, I can't do it from my end.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's, he's resisting again. He's going down there and just making a statement that he's going to sleep. Doesn't have to worry about it at all. And I imagine that makes the sailors very mad. So this is another thing that says that he's just doing something just because he wants to.
Right.
He wants
Right.
to show them that he's not going to do anything. And I imagine that's, well, if you're God's phone to do it. But I think it's just a matter of showing that his disregard.
Yeah. I think that's absolutely right. He flees. The word of the Lord, the word of Yahweh comes to him. He runs away. Now he's on the ship. And notice the language. And this is, I do not read Hebrew, but in some of my study, the language of in verse 2 or verse 3, he went down to Joppa, and then he went down into the inner part of the ship, right? And then in chapter 2, he's going to be in the depth of the belly of the whale. So, or the fish. I keep saying whale. It doesn't say whale in the Bible. So there's this image of Jonah going down, right? It's just down, 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 down to Joppa,
Right.
down to the ship, down into a deep sleep. So it really is a picture of spiritual slumber and spiritual apathy. And notice the contrast between all of the activity happening on the deck, the sailors that are doing what they know to do, right? To pray to their gods. And Jonah is in escape mode still, and is down in the belly of the ship. Yeah, Janice.
One of the commentaries I was listening to is the same thing with the theory of down, down, down. He goes down to Joppa. Then he's down in the ocean, down in the fish, down, 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 and then he starts going up, up, up. So it's, right. That motion through this whole story.
Yes, that's right.
And he's also going farther and farther away. He goes as far away as he can, and he gets on the ship. And then even in the ship, he's going to as farther away as he can from the Lord.
Yeah, that's right. So the captain of the ship, right? This pagan captain goes and finds Jonah. What do you mean, you sleeper? Arise, call out to your God, right? So I mean, again, this is the polytheistic response. We've all prayed to our gods. Get up here and you pray to your God, right? And maybe your God will do something to help us. And perhaps your God will give thought to us. And the Hebrew there actually says, will take notice of us. And it's ironic that the very fact that they're in this situation is because God has already taken notice, right? The word came to Jonah. God is watching over this whole thing. So there's some irony in the Hebrew there, that we may not perish. So verse 7, they said to one another, come, let us cast lots, that we may know on whose account this evil has come. Very common practice in the ancient world to discern the divine will or the will of the gods, to cast lots, to throw dice. Even in the book of Acts, when the disciples choose the replacement for Judas Iscariot, they cast lots to do that. So they cast lots, and surprise, the lot falls on Jonah. And they say to him, "Tell us on whose account this evil has come upon us. What is your occupation? Where do you come from? What is your country? And of what people are you?" Right? So they put Jonah on the spot. And listen to Jonah's response. "I am a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." Right? Now, there's irony here, right? Because where's Jonah? On a ship in the middle of the sea, trying to escape Yahweh, who he now claims to fear as the one who has power over the sea, right? So when you're reading this in the ancient context, you probably would have laughed out loud at Jonah's response here, given the circumstances that he's in. And has Jonah feared God at all yet?
No.
No evidence that he's living a life in awe or fear or reverence of Yahweh. So then the men who were now the men are afraid now, said to him, "What is this that you have done?" For the men knew that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord because he had told them. So this is the first time now we're getting the information that apparently when Jonah paid his fare and they said, "What is your business? Where you're going? What's going on?" Instead of sort of saying, "Well, I'm just heading, I have family in Tarshish." Jonah apparently said, "I'm fleeing from my God," right? So he's told them why he's on this ship. Then they said to him, "What shall we do to you that the sea may quiet down for us?" For the sea grew more and more tempestuous. And Jonah said, "Pick me up and hurl me into the sea. Then the sea will be quiet down for you. I know it is because of me that this huge tempest has come upon you." So what's Jonah's response? Just kill me, right? And there are a couple different ways that scholars interpret this. Some see this as a sign that Jonah might, finally be thinking about somebody other than himself. "I'll save these sailors. It's not their fault. Just kill me." Or, and I'm in this camp, it's another example of Jonah just, then I'm done. I didn't want to be here anymore. Just throw me overboard. It's better for me to die than to continue going through, this running away from Yahweh. What are your thoughts on that, Marilyn?
Well, I think it's significant that he doesn't take the initiative and jump overboard himself.
Yeah.
He could have saved them and been a hero for it. And instead he puts the burden on them. He says, "Throw me overboard."
Yeah. That's a great insight. And I think that furthers the view that, this is more selfishness on Jonah's part, I guess all that's left is to kill me, but you're going to have to do it. Right. And he puts it on them. Yeah. Janice.
Yeah, and that adds to the problem, because then they feel the guilt of that would be murder. So he does do that. And at the beginning of the session, Debbie had asked the question, what do you think he was trying to act? This is such a childlike behavior with a parent, and this is where you should be punished so much, you caused all this. What's the child say? "Oh, well, just, beat me," or whatever. He's got this flip attitude about the whole thing and putting the burden totally on them.
Right. Yeah, Debbie.
I have a totally different kind of feeling or take on it at this point, because you said, Father Doug, that ultimately we'll find out that he said he didn't want to go because he had great faith that God was going to have mercy anyway. So, do you really need me to do this? So my thought now is, could this not all be a sign of Jonah's great faith in God, that he goes below, he goes to sleep. I know things are going to be okay. That's faith. Then he says to them, he confesses that He fears Lord God of the heaven who made the sea and the dry land, and then just kill me. So it's almost like, I mean, to me, that's what I'm feeling. I may be totally out and left field on this, but a great faith there that, you know, on one hand, you can see it as a childlike behavior, or is it really that he just knows that ultimately God is in control and just go ahead and kill me, and because I know things are going to be okay? Is that like really out there in terms of
Well,
how to
I
look at
think
it?
that would work, except for the fact that I don't think it's faith that motivates Jonah. I don't think it's that Jonah thinks, you know, God is going to do what God's going to do. So, you know, I'm not really needed, or I'm not sure what his response would be. In chapter 4, he's mad that God was merciful, you know. So his resistance to go is because he knows that God is going to be merciful to the Ninevites. And the Ninevites, for Jonah and for all of the ancient Israelites, were the arch enemy, right? Brutal. They had attacked well, this may be before they attacked the northern kingdom. It probably is. But they were known for their brutality. And so Jonah wants no part of God's plan to be merciful and gracious to the Ninevites. So if that's his motivation, then he clearly is running away from that mission of mercy and grace, and he's mad about it and wants no part of it, and wants to shut out sort of the word of Yahweh from his life. But let's hold that thought, and as we get through the book, we'll see, you know, how Jonah's, you know, what we think about Jonah's motivations. Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to add to that right now, because I don't think it was faith at all, because I think it's proof through the entire book that if he had faith from the very beginning and had done what God had expected of him, and you go through this entire book, and then it's proven to him that these bad people by faith were saved. It is all about faith, but he didn't have faith, or he would have never run in the other direction. He would have gone straight forward and obeyed God. So I think it's a test of faith, and it's proven in a different way in the entire story.
Yeah, I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves, but you're absolutely right, I think. And, you know, Jonah has a very successful mission, and we'll see that in chapter 3. But it's successful because of nothing that he has done, right? His sermon in chapter 3 is 5 words in Hebrew, right? It's 8 words in most English translations. It's 5 words in Hebrew, and it basically says nothing about God or what the Ninevites have done or anything, and yet it leads to this huge repentance, including the cows, right, that are wearing sackcloth and ashes. And that makes Jonah so mad. And so in chapter 4, we're going to see Jonah's response to God's gracious act. And really, chapter 4 becomes then the interpretive lens that we have to then read the rest of the story through. So I think, Debbie, you're right that at this point, as we're reading it, maybe we're not supposed to know yet what his motivations are. You know, if you've read through the whole book, I think we know where we're going in chapter 4. But at this point, if you're just hearing this told orally in the ancient world, maybe there is meant to be some ambiguity. Is this faith? Is this anger? Is this fear? What's going on with this man of God, this prophet? Yeah, Alex, do you want to add something? Oh, okay. Thought you were going to hold up a sign for us.
I want to say something. Can you still hear me?
Yep, go ahead, Wendy.
I don't know if this is significant, but to me, this whole story of calming the sea, just get in and calm the sea, is so reminiscent of Jesus in the boat in the storm. I don't know. To me, I just was thinking of that when I read this, where the crew appealed to Jonah. Well, appeal to your God and calm the sea, just like the disciples did during that storm. I don't know.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, you know, but my reading of it is that it's almost the inverse, right? That the pagan sailors are the ones that get it and are trying to you know, and we'll see this at the end here. And Jonah is the one that's hiding and asleep. And in the story of Jesus, it's the disciples who are afraid and don't get it, and Jesus, who is asleep, gets it, right? And so there's this sort of turning of it upside down in the gospel story. Self-centered, not spiritually driven, only fear driven. Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, I think we're meant to see the contrast between the pagan sailors who are not supposed to understand what's going on spiritually, and Jonah, who is in a place of sort of spiritual apathy and spiritual sleep, running away from Yahweh.
Father Doug, do you want me to try to help Alex unmute herself? I think.
Well, we've got 15 minutes, so
Okay.
but we'll try to resolve that before next week.
She
So
keeps
maybe
okay.
we'll reach out to
It
her.
would be an easy thing. So okay.
Yeah. So will someone read verses 11
This
through?
Mary Jane.
Yeah, Mary Jane.
Yes, I was going to say I have a different take on this. I think he's sort of baiting God in a way. I think he's just sort of saying, "Okay, I'm not going to go along with this story. I'm going to resist." I think he's just sort of I think he's just knows he's trying to. I think he's just sort of baiting God in a way. I think he's just okay. I know you're the God. I know you're the one who's created heaven and earth. But if you think I'm going to go down to Nineveh and tell them this, you're wrong. I don't know. I just think it's a defiance. But
Yeah.
I'm probably could be very wrong.
Yeah. Yeah.
He sounds like just somebody that's going to get up and say, "Okay, I'm not going to do that. What are you going to do about it?"
Yeah.
And of course, he finds out.
Well, and there's a bit you can hear overtones of, especially when he's in the fish and he goes down to the depths. And next week when we get into chapter 2, I'll share. This is a theme. The image of being swallowed up, the image of being brought down to the depths, down to the pit. These are images that the psalmists use, that the prophets use to talk about this journey, particularly of the Israelites in exile, right? Being brought to this lowest point and then being brought out of exile, So in some ways, the fish in a story like this becomes the sort of physical embodiment of these metaphors that the psalmists and prophets have been using. So will someone read 11 through 17?
I'll read it.
Go ahead, Debbie.
So they said to him, "What should we do to you that the sea may become calm for us?" For the sea was becoming increasingly stormy. He said to them, "Pick me up and throw me into the sea. Then the sea will become calm for you. For I know that on account of me, this great storm has come upon you." However, the men rowed desperately to return to land, but they could not, for the sea was becoming even stormier against them. Then they called on the Lord and said, "We earnestly pray, O Lord, do not let us perish on account of this man's life, and do not put innocent blood on us, for you, O Lord, have done as you have pleased." So they picked up Jonah, threw him into the sea, and the sea stopped its raging. Then the men feared the Lord greatly, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows. And the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was in the stomach of the fish 3 days and 3 nights.
Perfect. So the captain of the ship went to Jonah and said, "Hey, pray to your God." Does Jonah ever actually pray to his God? No. Who prays to his God?
They do.
They do.
The pagan sailors, right?
All right.
And they name him Yahweh. Oh, Yahweh. So they've prayed to all their other gods, nothing worked. So now they pray to Yahweh. Let us not perish for this man's life, and lay not on us innocent blood. This goes back to what Marilyn was saying. If we're gonna have to do this, we've tried everything else. We tried rowing back. We shoved everything off the ship. We prayed to all of our gods. We're praying to you. If we have to throw this guy over, hey, it's not on us, right? So they picked up Jonah, hurled him into the sea, and the sea ceased its raging. Then the men feared the Lord, exceedingly feared the Lord. They offered sacrifices and made vows, right? So Jonah, who gave lip service to this, I'm a Hebrew. I fear Yahweh, the God of heaven, who has authority over the land and the sea. You know, Jonah claims this as his spiritual pedigree, but does nothing with it. The sailors, who are supposed to be ignorant and worshiping all these other gods, they're the ones who pray to Yahweh, exceedingly fear the Lord, offer sacrifices, and make vows. And some scholars point out, and I don't think this is an important detail, but that they probably wouldn't have offered sacrifices on the ship because that required fire. And so, could it be that this actually is an extension? This happened over an extended period of time, where they got back to wherever, Joppa, or wherever they finally made it back, and went to a temple of Yahweh and offered a sacrifice there. We don't know that detail, but suffice it to say that the response of the pagan sailors is what you would expect from the prophet, the man of God. And the man of God, who should be fearing and worshiping and praying to Yahweh, is running away.
And he ends up the sacrifice. Or
What's that?
whatever.
What's that, Mary Jane?
I say the man of God is the sacrifice in that respect.
Yeah. And I mean, in terms of calming the sea. Yeah, Janice.
When you read this, it really reiterates that God is always in control. And that, like we said, why didn't Jonah just jump in and save them all this? And they took the extra step. They didn't throw them overboard. They decided to try to row to shore, which is a very dangerous situation for them. They could have easily died. And the footnote there says, the ship could be driven by sails, or the reluctance of the sailors to throw Jonah into the sea stands in sharp contrast to Jonah's reluctance to warn Nineveh of impending judgment. It's, both sides of it. And I see now that God's in control of this. And look what happened to these pagans. If he had jumped in the water, maybe, and the calm sea would have happened immediately, they might not have done that.
Yeah.
But also, if I may add, I see it as a way God was working through Jonah to also bring these pagans to see him as God and truly the God in control. So to turn them around to really believe in him as well. That's another piece of it that I am taking away from it.
Good.
But don't you think that God is working in spite of Jonah?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
In some ways? Yeah.
But he's also using Jonah to really let these pagans see his power and his control over the situation and turn them to him, God.
Yeah.
I don't know, maybe
Yeah, because I mean, Jonah does, even though I think it's sort of lip service, he does name Yahweh. So I mean, their introduction to Yahweh is through Jonah. I am a Hebrew and I fear Yahweh. I fear the Lord. But Jonah does nothing with that statement.
No, but they acknowledge Jonah's God as his God until this point when they pray to God to save them.
Yeah.
But before this point, they're saying to Jonah, you pray to your God.
Yes. Yeah.
True.
God works in mysterious ways.
Well, I also hear a bit, especially if we get into chapter 2 next week, I hear Psalm 139, right? Where can I go from your presence? If I climb up to the heights, you are there. If I go down to the depths, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. Jonah thinks he can run away from Yahweh, right? He thinks that Yahweh is not taking notice. And yet we as the reader know that all of this is happening at the hand of the Lord, at the hand of Yahweh to Jonah. So the Lord appointed a great fish. I mean, I don't know. in my translation, the word great is the translation of the Hebrew word huge. I think we're up to at least four occurrences where everything's big in Jonah, right?
Mm-hmm.
Big waves, big storm. Now it's a big fish, great big fish, swallows up Jonah, and Jonah's in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. Now, if the story, and if we only had chapter 1, this is a tragedy, right? This is Jonah, the prophet, the man of God, who's given a mission. He tries to run away from Yahweh, and now he's done. He's in the belly of the fish. No one can survive 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a fish, right? So if you're just reading chapter 1, if this was a 4-act play or something, you'd finish chapter 1 and think, Jonah's done. There goes Jonah, the man of God. And yet what we're going to see is there's this, embodiment, this living out of what the psalmists and prophets have talked about, of God's people going to the depths and discovering God there. And I think there is some genuine self-discovery and sort of coming to terms with Jonah coming to terms with his relationship with God, with Yahweh, in the belly of the fish. And then, of course, chapter 2 will end with the fish vomiting him back on the land. But at the end of chapter 1, we think Jonah's done, right? He got thrown overboard.
Mm-hmm.
The sailors are the heroes. They worshiped and fear God. And Jonah's in the belly of a big fish.
Yep.
Kaput, done. So are you beginning to see the intensity of the story as satire, that you're meant to feel the extremes in the story in terms of where Jonah is emotionally, at some points I read the first part of the episode on the ship almost like a silent movie, where I'm just picturing these sailors running around, throwing things, trying anything, throwing their hands up, just very comic, watching these pagan sailors try to do whatever they can to save themselves. Yeah, Janice.
Well, 3 things. First of all, watch the Bible Project on this if you haven't, where he's screaming the 5 words, and it's really very comical. And the second thing I want to say is, I've mentioned this before, but I'm not a book and verse person, but I am a hymn person. I have a jukebox of hymns in my head that whenever I study, something will come to me. Well, guess what came to me? Here I am, Lord. Which is the ironic thing. No, I'm here, but I'm not ready to do whatever you want me to do. And there is another thing I read, which was a commentary, apparently a true story. It happened in the Falkland Islands, where these 2 sailors were out in the water and a whale hit the boat or whatever. One drowned immediately, but one was in the mouth or in the body of the whale, and after 2 days was spit up, and he survived. For whatever it's worth.
Wow.
Interesting. Well, Janice, you mentioned the Bible Project. The pastor scholar who oversees that is Tim Mackey, the guy I mentioned earlier. So he's phenomenal. Really, really.
How do you spell his last name?
I think it's Mackie.
Okay.
And,
because like you say, Jonah goes shouting those 5 words all over. It's really funny. Under the tree, and then, it's just really, really cute.
Yeah. So just in conclusion, we've got Jonah, the man of God, the prophet. The word of the Lord comes to him. We're expecting, prophetic oracles from Jonah. And what we get is a story about Jonah, who begins to sort of embody this mission of mercy and grace. But he runs from that call, goes to the other end of the world, literally, tries to go to the other end of the world, gets caught in the great storm, is asleep at the wheel, doesn't gives lip service to Yahweh, but doesn't pray, doesn't cry out, doesn't ask for mercy. But it's the pagan sailors that do. But so I wonder, from a spiritual standpoint, the 2 elements that I think about are the ways in which we how many times do we run from what God has for us, maybe not to the ends of the earth, but spiritually, emotionally run away from the hard things. And then sort of this whole theme of spiritual apathy, where we're just done. We're in the bottom of the ship, we're sleeping. We know there's this spiritual reality that's going on around us, but we're not engaged. And the other thing that's important to point out here is that Jonah never does anything explicit to the sailors, right? He never specifically sort of sins against them, but the consequences of his sin have ramifications for those around him. And it sort of reinforces that, we can never think that, our sin or our alienation from God and one another is just about us. Jonah thinks it's about him, right? But ultimately his own disobedience and sin creates this storm literally around him that affects everybody around him. So those are some spiritual things to sort of reflect on with Jonah. Yeah, Marilyn.
Yeah, well, I've been wrestling with this whole idea of the sailors turning and then praying, for forgiveness for what they were about to do. And I think what I'm coming out is that it's Jonah's own weakness that becomes the instrument of their salvation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and the same. I think the same is going to be true in chapter 3. It'll be Jonah's weakness and even his indifference that God ultimately works in spite of, or perhaps through. But it's going to be interesting.
From a spiritual standpoint, you just said, Father Doug, and I refuse to get political, and I won't do that. But in our lives today, we all should take a huge introspection into exactly what we just learned this morning from this first chapter.
Yeah. Well, like I said, that's part of the beauty and brilliance of this form, this genre of satire that we're not used to finding in the Bible. Or perhaps there's more of it, and we're just not, we don't think of Saturday Night Live in the Bible as sharing any attributes. But I think this whole idea that we look at this crazy story, everything's out of proportion, everything's turned upside down. We're sort of laughing at Jonah by the end of the story, and then we realize that's us, right? That everything that Jonah gets caught up in, from running from God, spiritual apathy, angry that God is merciful and gracious to our enemies. At the end of it, we're looking in the mirror and we see ourselves. And I think that's why the book ends with a question, because we're left with this, now what are you going to do, sort of thing. So that's where we're going to end up. So are you enjoying Jonah so far?
Yes,
very much.
This is great.
Yes,
I'm very excited about this book, and by the end of it, in 3 more weeks, I think we'll have a really profound experience of understanding how Jonah's wrestling with grace and how we wrestle with grace. Mm-hmm. And then when we get into Philippians, we'll have a very different sort of experience with Paul, and then we'll go back to the Old Testament with Ruth and Boaz and that whole story. So it's going to be a lot of fun for the next 12 weeks. So. All right, I'll sign off, and you all have a great day. And
thank
I will see
you.
next Wednesday.
Thank you.
Well,
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I want to say hello from New York.
Yes, good to see you, Emily.